Ever heard the saying, it takes one to know one? Well, get ready to dive into Operation Paperclip, because we're going to see that the race to space wasn't always squeaky clean, good versus evil.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. You've given me some fascinating documents on this, and I have to say, unpacking the story, it really reveals a side of the space race that, well, they didn't exactly teach us about in school.
What always gets me is how often history, kind of surprises us with its complexities.
Right.
We like to simplify the past, put it into these neat little narratives. But the closer you look, and I think that's what we're doing here, the more you see the blurred lines, the really tough choices, and sometimes, the completely unexpected outcomes.
Exactly. And, in 1945, World War II is finally over, but there's a new kind of tension brewing on the world stage, the Cold War.
Yeah.
You've got the U.S. and the Soviet Union, former allies, now locked in this struggle for, global dominance, right?
Absolutely. And it went way beyond just ideologies. Both superpowers knew that to really control the future, they needed to control technology. Nuclear weapons, that was huge. But also rocketry. That was clear. Whoever led in those areas, they'd lead the world.
And that's where Operation Paperclip comes in. This is where things take a turn, and I gotta say, it's a pretty fascinating one. See, instead of just, taking apart captured German tech, the U.S. decided to bring in the brains behind it.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking German scientists, engineers, technicians, and here's the kicker. Many of them, they were straight out of the Nazi regime.
It was a gamble, no doubt. But the U.S., they recognized that the knowledge these German scientists had built up, it was just too valuable to ignore. So over 1,600 of them were, shall we say, discreetly relocated to the U.S., given positions with the government, and let's just say their past affiliations, they weren't always given the highest priority.
The sheer scale of this is incredible. We're talking about a relocation of over 6,000 people, families included, and the value of the expertise they brought with them, try a staggering $10 billion in today's money.
It shows you how much emphasis the U.S. placed on getting ahead in the Cold War. They were willing to make some, let's just say, difficult decisions, even morally ambiguous ones, if it meant staying one step ahead.
And sometimes those decisions, they came with a name. Like Wernher von Braun, the man behind Germany's V-2 rocket program, the rocket that terrified London during the war. Yet this same guy, he becomes a major player in the U.S. space program.
Von Braun, he's like a walking, talking example of the ethical tightrope the U.S. was walking with all this. Like, how do you reconcile the sheer brilliance of a scientist with the potential horrors of their past?
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
So we've got this race for technology, right? And the U.S. is, they're basically recruiting German scientists, some with a past they probably want to keep under wraps. Sounds like something out of a spy movie. Do they have, secret agents, in trench coats, scouring war-torn Germany, looking for these guys?
Well, it might surprise you to learn the U.S. got a little help from the Nazis themselves on this one.
Oh.
Remember that Ozenberg list you mentioned?
Yep.
That list, it was compiled by the German government. Very meticulously, I might add. It was their own documentation of the scientists and engineers they considered most important to the war effort.
Wow. So talk about, handing them a golden ticket, right? I mean, what a valuable piece of intel, but how did the U.S. even get their hands on this list in the first place?
As the Allies closed in, and things weren't looking so good for the Nazi regime, this list, along with a treasure trove of other documents, fell into Allied hands. It was like finding a map, but instead of buried treasure, it leads you right to, the brains behind the operation.
Talk about irony of ironies, right?
Right.
A list that's supposed to prop up the Nazi war machine ends up being the key to advancing the U.S. agenda. But, and this is a big but, it really brings the ethical dilemma of Operation Paperclip front and center, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because you're not just acquiring knowledge, are you? You're inheriting the legacy of the people who produced it.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know, finding a vintage car, a beautiful one, but then you find out it was owned by, let's just say, a very notorious criminal. So, do you admire the craftsmanship, or does that history taint it a little bit?
It's a really good analogy, and it brings us back to Wernher von Braun. I mean, he is the embodiment of this whole dilemma. Here you have this brilliant mind, right? Someone who helped us reach for the stars, literally. But his genius, it was also, at least in part, nurtured within the Nazi regime.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You can't deny what he accomplished, The guy was a pioneer in rocket science, essential to NASA's success. But on the other hand, he was a high-ranking SS officer, used slave labor to build the V-2. So how do you even begin to reconcile those two sides of a legacy?
It's a question that historians are still wrestling with today. And there's no easy answer. I mean, you can't just erase von Braun's contributions to science and space exploration. But then again, we can't just brush aside the fact that his ambitions were, at least for a time, intertwined with the Nazi regime.
In the U.S. government, they were willing to, let's just say, downplay that past, right? Especially as the Cold War was heating up. They saw his talent, saw his potential, and, well, maybe they believed the ends justified the means.
It's a complex moral equation, that's for sure. And to be honest, the U.S. government, they weren't always upfront about the pasts of these scientists they brought in. Some might even say they actively tried to, well, bury some of those details.
So it becomes this game of secrets, right? Scientific advancement on one hand, moral compromise on the other, with incredibly high stakes.
Absolutely. And the consequences of that game, they would end up shaping not just space exploration, but the relationship between science and ethics for decades to come.
So these scientists, some with, shall we say, colorful pasts, they land on American soil, right? What happens next? Are they whisked off to top secret labs and, building rockets in their spare time?
It wasn't quite as dramatic as a Bond film, but the stakes were definitely high. A lot of these German scientists found themselves in places like Fort Bliss, Texas, White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico, working on projects that would, well, they'd really shape the future of American rocketry, missiles even.
It's like dropping the creators of, the jet engine into the middle of like a car company and saying, all right, do your thing.
Exactly. And the irony isn't lost on anyone, right? The V-2 rocket, this weapon of war, this thing that caused so much destruction, it becomes the foundation, the very basis for a lot of the U.S. space program. It's almost poetic, taking this technology that instilled so much fear and using it for, well, exploration, for science.
So the U.S. is basically taking this weapon, but instead of, dismantling it, they say, let's study it, let's understand it, let's make it better.
Exactly. They meticulously studied, captured V-2 rockets, reverse engineered them, tested them. Imagine, like, trying to rebuild a complex clock, but it's been smashed to pieces. That's what these engineers were dealing with as they took apart the V-2 piece by piece.
It boggles the mind. I mean, who knows? Maybe without those captured V-2s, without Operation Paperclip, even the space race, it's a completely different ballgame. Would we even have reached the moon when we did? It makes you think, doesn't it?
One of history's big what-ifs.
Yeah.
Right? But it's clear that Operation Paperclip, it accelerated things, that's for sure. American rocketry, the space program, it all got a huge boost.
It's a mixed bag, though, right? On one hand, you've got this incredible scientific achievement. On the other, there's this moral compromise that's hard to ignore. We celebrate the moon landing, all these technological marvels, but we have to remember how it all came to be. And part of that story, it's a program that, well, let's just say it didn't look too closely at the backgrounds of some of its key players.
Absolutely. And that's the thing we have to keep in mind. We have to look back at these events, these uncomfortable truths, and ask ourselves these tough questions. How do we reconcile the good with the bad? How do we deal with the fact that sometimes progress, well, it comes at a cost?
Because this wasn't just some isolated incident, right? This is history repeating itself. We see it again and again, the pursuit of knowledge, of progress, butting up against these ethical choices.
Right. And as we keep pushing the boundaries, with science, with technology, it's more important than ever to remember these lessons from the past, to be aware of the potential consequences, to really think about what we're doing and why. And maybe, just maybe, by having these conversations, we can avoid making the same mistakes.
Well said. It sounds like Operation Paperclip, it's more than just a history lesson, isn't it? It's a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that progress, it's not always a straight line, and sometimes those great leaps forward, they're intertwined with some difficult truths. Definitely gives us all something to think about.
It does, and maybe that's the biggest takeaway here. We learn from history, we acknowledge its complexities, and we use that knowledge to guide us as we move forward.
A truly fascinating deep dive into a really complex chapter in history. And sometimes, you know what they say, sometimes it's the stories with more questions than answers that are the most important ones to tell.